The heat that carried them, the night Ethan Cole opened his door to a woman covered in blood and bruises, he thought he was letting in ghosts. Margaret Hale collapsed against his door frame, her daughter Nora standing behind her with eyes too old for 8 years, whispering, "He'll kill her if you don't help." Behind them, the Montana summer night pulsed with heat and the distant thunder of hooves. Ethan had spent 5 years hiding from the world in his isolated ranch, nursing wounds the war had carved into his soul. But some nights don't give you the luxury of staying hidden. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you're drawn into Margaret and Ethan's fight for survival under the unforgiving Montana sun, hit that like button and stay until the end. You won't believe where this journey takes them. The cabin stood alone against the Montana horizon, like a gravestone marking where hope went to die. Ethan Cole built it that way deliberately, far enough from town that neighbors wouldn't come calling, close enough to water that he wouldn't die of thirst before he found the courage to care whether he lived or died. 5 years since Appomattox, and the war still lived in his bones, in the way his hands shook when the wind carried certain smells, in the hours he spent staring at nothing while the sun traced its arc across the sky. Summer in 1875 came to Montana like divine punishment. The heat pressed down on the prairie with physical weight, turning the air thick and hostile. Grass that should have been green lay brown and brittle, crunching under boot heels like old bones. Waterholes dried to mud, then to dust. Cattle stood hollow-eyed in whatever shade they could find, too exhausted to move. At night, the temperature barely dropped, just shifted from brutal to merely oppressive, and the cabin held the day's heat like a baker's oven, releasing it slowly through walls that creaked and settled in the darkness. Ethan had stopped fighting the heat weeks ago. He left the windows open despite the dust, slept on top of the blankets when he slept at all, and moved through his days with the mechanical precision of a man who had forgotten why he bothered. Feed the horses, check the water, mend the fence where the posts had dried and split, cook something, eat it or don't. Watch the sunset. Wait for morning. The routine held him together the way a splint holds a broken bone. It didn't heal anything, but it kept the pieces from falling apart completely. The knocking came just after midnight on the kind of night when even the crickets had given up singing. 3 sharp raps, urgent and uneven, followed by a sound that might have been a sob or might have been the wind. Ethan was at the table, a glass of whiskey untouched in front of him, a letter from his brother Samuel spread out in the lamplight. The letter was 4 years old, the last one before Samuel stopped writing, before the silence that meant either death or something worse. The knocking came again, more desperate this time, and Ethan's hand moved to the rifle leaning against the wall before his conscious mind caught up with his body. War reflexes died hard. He crossed to the door in 3 strides, rifle ready, and called out, "State your business." "Please." The voice was female, ragged with exhaustion and pain. "Please, we need help." Ethan hesitated. Women didn't travel the Montana plains at night. Not alone, not ever. This was a trap or a test or a nightmare his whiskey-soaked brain had conjured from nothing. But the voice came again, weaker now, and underneath it, he heard a child crying. He opened the door. The woman collapsed forward into his arms before he could step back, her weight sudden and real against his chest. She was small, dark-haired, dressed in what had once been a traveling dress, but was now torn and dust-covered, stained dark in places he recognized as blood. Her face was a battlefield of bruises, fresh ones blooming purple along her jaw, older ones yellowing around her left eye. Her lip was split, still bleeding, and when she tried to speak, her words came out slurred and broken. Behind her stood the child, 8 years old, maybe 9, with her mother's dark hair and eyes that belonged to someone who had seen too much and forgotten nothing. She wasn't crying anymore. She stood perfectly still in the doorway, one hand gripping her mother's torn skirt, the other hanging at her side in a fist. When she looked at Ethan, he saw no fear, only a terrible, ancient assessment. "He'll kill her if you don't help," the girl said. Her voice was steady, matter-of-fact, as if she were commenting on the weather. "We walked all day. She can't walk anymore." Ethan stood frozen, the woman's weight growing heavier in his arms, the child's eyes boring into him like accusations. Every instinct he'd cultivated over 5 years of isolation screamed at him to close the door, to pretend this hadn't happened, to protect the fragile peace he'd built from other people's catastrophes. He'd left the war behind. He'd buried enough dead. He'd earned his right to be left alone. The woman stirred against his chest, trying to lift her head. "Please," she whispered again, and the word cracked something inside him that had felt permanently hardened. "Come inside," he heard himself say. He half carried, half dragged the woman to his bed, the only real piece of furniture in the cabin besides the table and chairs. The child followed, moving with eerie silence, her eyes tracking everything: the rifle by the door, the whiskey on the table, the window overlooking the eastern approach. She positioned herself between her mother and the door, a small sentinel in a torn dress and bare feet. In the lamplight, the damage was worse than Ethan had thought. The woman's left arm hung at an odd angle, possibly broken. Dark bruises ringed her throat in the unmistakable pattern of fingers. Her breathing came shallow and pained, suggesting cracked ribs. Whoever had done this had done it thoroughly, with the kind of sustained violence that went beyond momentary rage into something colder and more deliberate. "What's your name?" Ethan asked, keeping his voice low and steady the way he'd learned to do with wounded soldiers who were trying not to scream. The woman's eyes found his, and for a moment she seemed to be deciding something. Then she said, Margaret Hale." The name meant nothing to Ethan, but the child's hand tightened on her mother's skirt. "And this is Nora," Margaret continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "My daughter." "Who did this to you?" Margaret's eyes closed. For a moment, Ethan thought she'd passed out, but then she spoke, each word an effort. "My husband, Victor Hale." The name still meant nothing, but the way she said it, like an incantation against evil, told him everything he needed to know about the man. "He'll come looking," the child said. Not Nora, she'd earned the right to her name. "He always comes looking." Ethan met her eyes and saw his own past reflected there. The war had taught him that some men hunted other people the way wolves hunted deer, not from hunger, but from nature. He'd known officers who got a taste for it, who kept killing long after the orders stopped making sense. He'd seen what happened to the people caught in their paths. "Then we'll deal with it when he gets here," Ethan said. He spent the next hour doing what he could for Margaret's injuries. His hands remembered the motions from the war, splinting the broken arm with kindling and torn cloth, wrapping the ribs tight to support the damaged bones, cleaning the cuts and abrasions with water and whiskey. She bit down on a leather strap and didn't scream, which told him more about her life than any words could have. Nora watched everything with those ancient eyes, occasionally handing him things before he asked: the whiskey bottle, clean rags, the basin of water. She seemed to know what he needed through some instinct he didn't understand and didn't question. When he finished, Margaret had drifted into something between sleep and unconsciousness, her breathing steadier but still labored. "She needs rest," Ethan said quietly, "and water when she wakes. There's a pump outside." "I know," Nora said. "I saw it when we came." Of course she had. This child saw everything. Ethan pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down, suddenly aware of how tired he was. The clock on the mantel showed nearly 2 a.m. Outside, the heat pressed against the windows like something alive, and the darkness beyond held whatever was coming. "Tell me about your father," he said to Nora. The child didn't move, didn't blink. "He's not my father. He's Mama's husband. My father died before I was born." The distinction seemed important to her, so Ethan nodded. "Tell me about Victor Hale, then." Nora was quiet for a long moment, her small face thoughtful. When she spoke, her voice carried the careful precision of someone who had learned that words mattered, that the truth could be a weapon or a shield depending on how you wielded it. "He owns things," she said. "Land, cattle, people, he thinks. He married Mama 3 years ago, after her family died in a fire. She had nowhere to go, and he seemed kind at first, but he isn't kind. He's angry all the time, angry at things that don't matter, and he takes it out on Mama. He says she belongs to him. He says I belong to him. He says if we leave, he'll find us and make us sorry." The words were delivered without emotion, just facts arranged in brutal order. Ethan had heard similar stories before, variations on a theme played out across 1,000 homesteads and ranches, where isolation gave certain men license to become monsters. How did you get away? He went to town for supplies. He'll be gone for 2 days, he said, but he lies sometimes. Comes back early to catch Mama doing something he can punish her for. So we left right away. We walked all day and all night. Mama said we had to find someone who would help. She said you were a doctor before the war. Ethan's hands tightened on the chair arms. I'm not a doctor anymore. But you were, Nora insisted. Mama said you lived out here alone because something bad happened in the war. She said men who've seen bad things sometimes understand better than men who haven't. Your mother knows me? She knows of you. People in town talk. They say you're the hermit who doesn't want visitors. But Mama said a man who chooses to be alone isn't the same as a man who hurts people to make them stay. She said you were our best chance. The assessment was delivered with such certainty that Ethan didn't know whether to be offended or impressed. Margaret Hale had gambled everything on the character of a stranger based on nothing but rumors and intuition, had dragged herself and her daughter across miles of hostile terrain on the hope that isolation meant kindness rather than indifference. She was wrong, Ethan said quietly. I'm not a good man. I'm just a man trying to forget. Nora's eyes never wavered. You helped us anyway. There was no arguing with that logic, so Ethan didn't try. Instead, he stood and checked the rifle, making sure it was loaded and within easy reach. Then he moved to the window and looked out at the darkness, searching for movement, for the dust trail of approaching riders, for any sign that Victor Hale had returned early and picked up their trail. The prairie stretched empty and still under a sky thick with stars. The heat shimmer made the horizon waver like something seen through water. Nothing moved except the wind pushing through the dry grass, carrying the smell of dust and distance. Get some sleep, Ethan told Nora. You can take the floor by your mother. I'll keep watch. You need sleep too, the child said. I don't sleep much anymore. Nora seemed to accept this. She curled up on the floor beside the bed, her hand reaching up to touch her mother's ankle through the blanket, maintaining contact even in sleep. Within minutes, her breathing had evened out, and she was gone, surrendering to exhaustion with the totality only children could manage. Ethan returned to his chair by the window and watched the night slowly surrender to dawn. His thoughts moved in circles, trying to solve a problem that had no good solution. If Victor Hale was the kind of man Nora described, and the evidence suggested she wasn't exaggerating, then he would come. Men like that always came. They couldn't tolerate defiance, couldn't abide the idea that something they considered theirs had escaped their control. The question wasn't if, but when, and what Ethan would do about it. He'd spent 5 years running from violence, from the responsibility of other people's lives, from the weight of decisions that meant death for someone. He'd built this cabin as a fortress against the world, not to protect himself from physical danger, but to protect himself from caring whether anyone lived or died. The war had burned that capacity out of him, or so he'd thought. But watching Margaret sleep, her face slack with exhaustion and pain, and Nora curled on the floor like a guard dog too small for the job, Ethan felt something stirring that he'd thought was dead. Not quite compassion, that was too generous a word, more like recognition. These were people who had been broken by circumstances beyond their control, who were trying to survive in a world that didn't care whether they made it or not. He knew what that felt like. Dawn came slowly, painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber. The heat began building immediately, the sun climbing into a sky already white with it. Ethan made coffee, strong and bitter, and drank it while watching Nora wake with a start, her eyes flying to her mother before relaxing fractionally when she saw Margaret still breathing. She hasn't woken up, Ethan said quietly. Nora nodded, as if she'd expected this. She stood, stretched with unselfconscious grace, and padded to the pump outside to splash water on her face. When she came back in, she looked more like a child and less like an old woman in a child's body, and Ethan felt something in his chest tighten. Are you hungry? He asked. Yes, Nora admitted. Then, remembering her manners, please. Ethan fried bacon and eggs, made Johnny cakes in the pan grease, and watched Nora eat with the focused intensity of someone who had learned not to waste food or take meals for granted. She cleaned her plate completely, sopping up the last of the egg yolk with the Johnny cake, and only then looked up at him. Thank you, she said. You're welcome. They fell into a strange domesticity. Ethan and this child, who spoke like an adult, moving around each other in the small cabin while Margaret slept, and the heat built outside like a living thing. Nora helped without being asked, washing the dishes in water heated on the stove, sweeping the floor, checking her mother's forehead for fever. Ethan went about his usual morning routine, feeding the horses, checking the water level in the trough, examining the fence line for damage. When he came back to the cabin an hour later, sweat-soaked and dusty, Margaret was awake. She was sitting up in bed, her good arm wrapped around Nora, her eyes tracking him as he entered. In daylight, without the shock and urgency of the night before, Ethan could see her more clearly. She was younger than he'd thought, maybe 30, with strong features and dark eyes that held both intelligence and exhaustion. Despite the bruises, despite the broken arm and cracked ribs, she held herself with a dignity that suggested she hadn't always been someone's punching bag. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was stronger now, clearer. "For helping us, for not turning us away." Ethan hung his hat on the peg by the door and crossed to the table. "You should still be sleeping." "I've slept enough, and I need to talk to you about what happens next." "What happens next is you rest until you're healed enough to travel. Then you and Nora can go wherever you planned to go when you left your husband." Margaret's laugh was bitter. "You think it's that simple? You think Victor will just let us disappear? What Victor wants stopped being relevant the moment you walked away from him. You don't know him." Margaret's hand tightened on Nora's shoulder. "You don't know what he's capable of." "I've known plenty of men like him," Ethan said quietly. "The war was full of them. Men who thought violence gave them the right to control other people. They all ended the same way eventually. This isn't the war. This is Montana territory, and Victor Hale owns half the county. The sheriff is his cousin. The judge is his drinking partner. If he says I'm his property, if he says Nora is his stepdaughter and we're runaways, who's going to tell him different?" The question hung in the air between them, and Ethan had no answer for it. She was right. The law out here was whatever the powerful decided it was. And if Victor Hale had the influence Margaret suggested, then legal protection was a fantasy. "Then you don't go back," Ethan said. "You go somewhere he can't find you, California, Oregon, somewhere far enough that his reach doesn't extend." "With what money? What resources?" "I have nothing, Mr. Cole. Everything I owned was Victor's first. The dress I'm wearing is one he bought me. The shoes Nora lost somewhere on the walk here were his gift on her last birthday. We left with nothing because we had nothing to take." Nora had gone very still against her mother's side, and Ethan could see the child processing this conversation, understanding the implications in a way no 8-year-old should have to understand anything. "I have some money," Ethan said. "Not much, but enough for train tickets, enough to get you started somewhere new." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, and she blinked them back furiously. "Why would you do that? You don't know us. We're nothing to you." "Maybe that's exactly why," Ethan said, "because I don't know you well enough to have reasons not to help." It wasn't the whole truth, but it was true enough. Margaret seemed to sense this, seemed to understand that some things couldn't be put into words without breaking them, and she nodded slowly. "Victor will come here," she said. "When he gets back from town and finds us gone, he'll track us. He's good at tracking, good at hunting, and when he finds out you helped us, he'll make you pay for it. I can't let you take that risk." "That's not your choice to make," Ethan said. "You came to my door asking for help. I gave it. Whatever comes next is between me and Victor Hale." "He'll kill you." "He can try." The words came out harder than Ethan intended, edged with something he thought he'd left behind in Virginia. Margaret must have heard it too, because her expression shifted, something like recognition crossing her bruised face. "Nora said you were a doctor," she said softly. "But you were a soldier first, weren't you?" Ethan didn't answer. He didn't need to. The rest of the morning passed in careful quiet. Ethan showed Margaret and Nora where things were. The food stores, the water pump, the small root cellar where he kept supplies cool. He explained the basics of the cabin's defense, showing Nora which window offered the best view of the approach, where he kept extra ammunition, how to bar the door from the inside if necessary. Margaret watched this with growing alarm, but she didn't protest. She understood that pretending danger didn't exist wouldn't make it go away. Around noon, the heat became unbearable. They moved everything they could outside to the shade of the cabin's north wall, sitting on crates and watching the horizon shimmer and dance. The horses stood motionless in the lean-to, too hot to do anything but breathe. Even the flies moved sluggishly, drunk on heat. "Tell me about yourself," Margaret said suddenly. "If we're going to bring trouble to your door, I should at least know who you are." Ethan considered refusing, but something in her voice, not curiosity, but genuine desire to know him as a person rather than a convenient shelter, made him relent. "Not much to tell," he said. "I grew up in Ohio, trained as a doctor, joined the Union Army as a surgeon, spent 4 years sewing people back together so they could go die somewhere else. When the war ended, I came west because I was tired of cities and people and noise. Built this cabin. Been here since." "You have family?" "A brother, Samuel. Younger than me by 3 years. He fought too, different regiment. We lost touch after the war." It was the same story he'd told himself so many times it had become truth through repetition, smooth and easy and completely incomplete. Margaret seemed to sense the gaps, but she didn't push. "And you've been alone out here for 5 years?" "Yes." "That's a long time to be alone." "It's long enough to get used to it." Nora had been quiet through this exchange, but now she spoke up, her voice thoughtful. "Mama says being alone is different from being lonely. She says alone is a choice, but lonely is what happens when you don't have any choices left." Both adults turned to look at her, and the child met their gazes with perfect equanimity, as if she'd said something obvious rather than profound. "Your daughter is very wise," Ethan said to Margaret. "She's always been this way," Margaret replied, something like sadness crossing her face. "Old soul," my mother used to say. "She sees things other people miss." "What do you see now?" Ethan asked Nora directly. The child tilted her head, considering the question seriously. "I see a man who's been hurt pretending he's healed. I see my mama trying to be brave when she's scared. And I see something coming from the east, still far away but getting closer." Ethan was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, scanning the horizon where Nora was looking. At first he saw nothing but heat shimmer and distance. Then, slowly, a dark spot resolved itself against the pale landscape. A rider, still miles away but coming steadily toward the cabin. "Get inside," Ethan said quietly. "Both of you, now." Margaret struggled to her feet, Nora supporting her weight, and they moved into the cabin. Ethan followed, barring the door behind them and positioning himself at the window with the best vantage point. He checked the rifle, made sure his revolver was loaded, and settled in to wait. The rider came on slowly, in no particular hurry, letting his horse pick its way across the rough ground. As he got closer, Ethan could make out details. A big man on a big horse, dressed in range clothes with a rifle across his saddle and a hat pulled low against the sun. He rode like someone who owned the land he crossed, confident and unhurried. When he was close enough for conversation, the rider stopped and called out, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Hello, the cabin. I'm looking for my wife and stepdaughter. 2 women, one of them hurt. You seen them?" Margaret made a small sound behind Ethan, terror and recognition mixed together. Nora put her hand over her mother's mouth, gently but firmly, and Margaret nodded, getting herself under control. Ethan didn't answer right away. He studied Victor Hale through the window, taking his measure. The man was big, probably 6'3", barrel-chested, and thick-armed. His face was weathered, hard, with small eyes and a mouth used to giving orders. Everything about him radiated authority and barely contained violence. "I said I'm looking for my wife," Hale called again, an edge creeping into his voice. "Name's Margaret. She ran off with my stepdaughter yesterday. Probably hurt, probably confused. I just want to bring them home where they belong." Still Ethan said nothing. Hale's horse shifted, sensing its rider's growing irritation. "Now look," Hale said, his voice hardening. "I know they came this way. I tracked them to your property line. If you're harboring them, that's theft. My wife is my property under the law, and the girl is my legal dependent. You got no right to keep them from me." Finally, Ethan spoke. "You need to leave my property, Mr. Hale." There was a long silence. Then Hale laughed, but there was no humor in it. "So they're here. You got any idea what you're doing, friend? Any idea who I am?" "I know what you are," Ethan said quietly. "And I know you need to leave. Now." Hale's hand drifted toward his rifle, and Ethan's finger tightened on the trigger of his own weapon. The moment stretched out, balanced on a knife's edge, until Hale seemed to think better of it and relaxed fractionally. "You're making a mistake," Hale said. "A big one. I'll be back, and I won't be alone. You think about that while you're playing hero to a thief and a liar." He wheeled his horse and rode away, but slowly, making sure Ethan understood this was a strategic retreat, not a surrender. Ethan watched until he was gone, until even the dust trail had settled, and only then did he lower the rifle. When he turned, Margaret was sitting on the bed, Nora beside her, and both of them were crying silently. "He knows where we are now," Margaret whispered. "He'll come back, and he'll bring men, and there's nothing you can do to stop him." Ethan set the rifle down and crossed to them. He knelt in front of Margaret so they were eye to eye, and when he spoke, his voice carried absolute certainty. "You listen to me, both of you. Victor Hale doesn't get to decide what happens here. You're under my protection now, and I don't give that up just because someone makes threats. Whatever comes next, we face it together. Do you understand?" Margaret searched his face, looking for doubt or fear or the willingness to cut losses and save himself. She found none of those things. Whatever she did find made her nod slowly. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Really?" Ethan thought about the question, thought about all the true answers he could give, because the war taught him that standing aside was its own kind of violence, because he was tired of running from the person he used to be, because sometimes the right thing to do was also the hardest thing to do, and he'd taken the easy way out for long enough. Instead, he said simply, "Because you asked for help, and I had the means to give it." It wasn't the whole truth, but it was true enough. And for Margaret Hale, bleeding and broken and terrified, it was enough to make her believe, just for a moment, that maybe they had a chance after all. Outside, the sun climbed toward its apex, and the heat built toward something unbearable. Somewhere to the east, Victor Hale was gathering his forces, planning his return, preparing to take back what he believed belonged to him. And in the small cabin that stood alone against the Montana plains, 3 people waited for nightfall and whatever came with it, bound together by nothing but circumstance and the fragile hope that sometimes, against all odds, kindness could be stronger than cruelty. The first day was ending, but the real fight was just beginning. The afternoon heat pressed down like a physical weight, turning the cabin into an oven despite the open windows. Ethan stood watch while Margaret slept fitfully, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion and pain. Nora sat cross-legged on the floor near the window, her small hands folding and refolding a piece of cloth she'd found, her eyes distant with thoughts too heavy for a child to carry. "He'll bring at least 6 men, Nora said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Maybe more. He has 12 who work for him regular, but only 6 he trusts with things like this." Ethan looked at the child, unsettled as always by the precision of her observations. "How do you know that?" "I listen. Men like Victor think children don't understand what they're hearing, so they talk in front of me like I'm furniture. He has men who work the ranch and men who do other things. The other things are always worse." The matter-of-fact delivery made the words even more disturbing. Ethan moved away from the window and sat on the floor across from her, close enough to talk quietly without waking Margaret. "Tell me about these men," he said. Nora's fingers stilled on the cloth. "There's Pike. He's the worst one. He likes hurting things. I've seen him beat horses for stumbling. He laughs when Victor hits Mama. Then there's the Kendall brothers, twins who do whatever Pike tells them. They're not smart, but they're mean. Red Jack, who used to be a lawman until he killed someone and had to leave Kansas. Thomas Bent, who doesn't talk much but always carries 2 guns. And Samuel." The name hit Ethan like a fist to the chest. "Samuel? He's newer than the others. Been with Victor maybe 6 months. He doesn't laugh like Pike does, doesn't seem to enjoy the work, but he does it anyway. Victor says Samuel understands loyalty, says he's the only one with real military training." Ethan's hands had gone cold despite the heat. "This Samuel, what does he look like?" Nora tilted her head, searching her memory. "Tall, brown hair, longer than yours, blue eyes. He has a scar here." She traced a line along her left forearm. "And he limps a little on his right side like something healed wrong." The room seemed to tilt. Ethan stood abruptly, crossed to the table where his brother's last letter still lay, yellowed and creased from years of handling. He picked it up with shaking hands, reading words he'd memorized long ago. Ethan, I know you told me not to write anymore, that you need to forget the war and everyone in it. But I can't just disappear from your life without explaining. I'm heading west to Montana Territory. I've got work lined up with a rancher, good pay, and maybe a chance to start over. I hope you're finding your peace, brother. I hope you're healing. Samuel. 4 years. 4 years of silence, and his brother had been less than 50 miles away, working for a man who beat women and terrorized children. The coincidence was too massive to be random, too precise to be fate. Victor Hale had somehow found Samuel Cole and pulled him into his orbit, and now the past Ethan had been running from was riding back to his door with guns and bad intentions. Mr. Cole? Nora's voice was uncertain, worried. Are you all right? Ethan forced himself to breathe, to think. This Samuel. Has he ever hurt you or your mother? Nora considered the question carefully. No, he's never hit us. But he stands there while Victor does. He doesn't stop it. Does that count as hurting? Yes, Ethan said quietly. It does. He moved back to the window, scanning the horizon for dust trails, for any sign of approaching riders. The prairie stretched empty and shimmering, but that wouldn't last. Victor Hale would use the remaining daylight to gather his men, to plan his approach. He'd come at dusk or dawn, when the light was tricky and defenders were tired. That gave Ethan maybe 12 hours to prepare. Margaret stirred onto the bed, her eyes opening slowly. She looked around the cabin, momentarily disoriented, then memory crashed back and her face tightened with fear. How long was I asleep? 3 hours, Ethan said. How do you feel? Like I was beaten and walked 20 miles. She tried to sit up, winced, and accepted Nora's help. Has there been any sign of Victor? Not since he left, but he'll be back. Margaret's hand found Nora's, gripping tight. Then we should leave. Now, before dark. If we're not here when he comes, maybe he'll leave you alone. He tracked you this far, Ethan said. He'll track you wherever you go. And in your condition, you won't make it 10 miles before he catches you. Then what do we do? Ethan had been asking himself that question for hours, turning possibilities over in his mind like stones, looking for one that didn't end in blood. He'd found none. Victor Hale wasn't the type to be reasoned with or scared off. He was the type who would burn down the world before admitting defeat. We make a stand, Ethan said. We make this place defensible, and we make it clear that taking you back will cost him more than he's willing to pay. You're talking about killing people, Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm talking about survival. There's a difference. Is there? Margaret's eyes were haunted. Once you start down that road, once you decide some lives matter less than others, where does it stop? Ethan thought about the war, about field hospitals where he'd had to choose who lived and who died based on nothing but odds and available supplies. He thought about the men he'd saved who went back to kill other men, and the men he couldn't save who died cursing him for failing. There were no clean hands in any of it. It stops when you and Nora are safe, he said. Everything else is just noise. Margaret held his gaze for a long moment, then looked at her daughter. Nora was watching both of them with those ancient eyes, processing everything, understanding too much. I don't want people to die because of me, Margaret said. Then you should have married a different man, Ethan replied, more harshly than he intended. But you didn't, and now we're here. You can hate what happens next all you want, but hating it won't change what needs doing. The words hung between them, brutal and true. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back, refusing to let them fall. What do you need us to do? She asked. Over the next several hours, Ethan transformed the cabin into a fortress. He showed Margaret and Nora how to stack flour sacks and crates as improvised barricades, how to position them to provide cover while maintaining firing angles on the approaches. He filled every container they had with water, knowing fire would be a likely tactic. He moved ammunition to strategic locations, making sure he could reload quickly from multiple positions. Nora proved surprisingly useful, her small size allowing her to wedge into spaces Ethan couldn't reach, her sharp mind grasping tactical concepts he didn't have to explain twice. She worked without complaint, even when the heat made sweat pour down her face and her arms trembled with exhaustion. "You're good at this," Ethan observed as she helped him nail boards across the lower half of the windows, creating shooting positions while protecting against incoming fire. "Victor used to make me watch when he planned things," Nora said, hammering with careful precision. "He said it was important for me to understand how men think, how they fight. He said a woman who understood violence was less likely to provoke it." The casual horror of the statement made Ethan's jaw tighten. "Your stepfather is wrong about a lot of things, but he's especially wrong about that." "I know," Nora said. "Violence doesn't need provoking. Some men carry it around like other men carry pocket watches, just waiting for an excuse to pull it out and use it," Margaret called from across the room, her voice strained. "Nora, don't talk like that. You're 8 years old." "I'm 8 years old who knows what's true," Nora replied, not looking up from her hammering. "Pretending different doesn't protect anybody." Margaret opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. What could she say? The child had learned these lessons in her house, under her roof, while Margaret herself had been too beaten down to protect her. The guilt of that showed in every line of her face. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the prairie in shades of amber and blood, Ethan made a final circuit of the cabin's perimeter. He checked sight lines, tested the barricades, and positioned supplies within easy reach. The place would never withstand a sustained assault, but it might survive the kind of quick raid Victor Hale would likely attempt: come hard, overwhelm the defenders, take what he wanted, and leave before consequences could catch up. When he came back inside, Margaret had managed to stand and was moving carefully around the cabin despite her injuries, checking on Nora, straightening things that didn't need straightening. She was trying to maintain some sense of normalcy, some connection to the ordinary routines that had defined her life before everything fell apart. "You should rest," Ethan said. "Save your strength." "I'm tired of resting, tired of being weak and hurt and useless." She turned to face him, and despite the bruises, despite the broken arm and the obvious pain, there was steel in her spine. "I can shoot. My father taught me before he died. Give me a rifle and I'll pull my weight." "With one arm?" "I've got one good arm and a working trigger finger. That's all I need." Ethan studied her, weighing risks and necessities. Having another gun in the fight could make the difference, but if she passed out from pain or couldn't maintain her position, she'd be a liability. Still, he recognized the look in her eyes, the desperate need to be something other than a victim, to have agency in her own survival. "All right," he said, "but you stay inside, behind cover. You shoot at anyone who comes through that door without my say-so. Can you do that?" "Yes." He gave her the spare rifle, showed her the best position to defend from, made sure she understood the fields of fire and the importance of not hitting him by accident. Margaret handled the weapon with familiarity, checking the load and the action with the ease of someone who'd done it before. Nora watched this transformation with something like pride. Mama used to hunt with Grandpa. She killed a bear once when it came after their camp. "That's not a story for now," Margaret said, color rising in her cheeks. "It's exactly a story for now," Ethan said. "Good to know you've got experience with dangerous animals." Something flickered across Margaret's face. Might have been a smile if the situation had been different. "Victor always said women had no business with weapons. Said it made them forget their place." "Your place is wherever you say it is," Ethan replied. "And right now, that's behind a rifle making sure nobody takes it from you again." The sun touched the horizon, flooding the cabin with golden light that made everything look softer and kinder than it was. They ate a cold meal of hardtack and dried beef, washing it down with water that tasted of metal and minerals. Nobody spoke much. There wasn't much to say that hadn't already been said. As darkness began to gather, Ethan extinguished the lamps, not wanting to give attackers easy targets. They sat in the growing shadows, listening to the night sounds. Crickets starting their evening chorus, the distant howl of a coyote, the creak and settle of wood contracting as the temperature finally began to drop. "Tell me about Samuel," Margaret said quietly. "Your brother. Nora says he works for Victor, but there's more to it than that. I can see it in your face." Ethan was silent for a long time, watching the last light fade from the sky. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and rough. "Samuel was 17 when the war started. I was 22. Our parents were dead, killed in a factory fire when I was 19. I was all Samuel had, and I told him to stay home, to stay safe. But he enlisted anyway, lied about his age, joined up with an Ohio regiment. I didn't find out until 6 months later when his commanding officer wrote to tell me Samuel had been wounded at Shiloh. He paused, the memories thick in his throat. I got transferred to his hospital, used what influence I had to make it happen. Found him with his leg half gone from a cannonball, infection setting in. I saved the leg, but it never healed right. Left him with that limp Nora mentioned. He was angry about it, angry at me for saving him when he wanted to die like a soldier instead of living like a cripple. We fought about it, said terrible things to each other. When the war ended, we went our separate ways. I came west. He wrote me that letter saying he was coming to Montana, and then nothing. 4 years of nothing. And now he's working for the man who beat me half to death, Margaret finished. That must feel like a betrayal. It feels like my fault, Ethan said. I pushed him away because I couldn't stand to look at him and see what the war did to both of us. If I'd been a better brother, maybe he wouldn't have ended up in Victor Hale's pocket. Nora spoke from her position by the window, her voice thoughtful. Samuel doesn't seem happy. I've watched him when Victor talks. When Victor laughs about things that aren't funny. Samuel's face goes empty, like he's not really there, like he's somewhere else in his head. That's how soldiers survive things they can't stomach, Ethan said. They go away inside themselves and wait for it to be over. Then maybe he doesn't want to do this, Nora said. Maybe if you talk to him. 4 years, Nora. 4 years he's been here, and he never once wrote out to see if I was alive or dead. He made his choice. The finality in Ethan's voice ended the conversation. They settled into tense silence, each lost in their own thoughts as full darkness fell and the cabin became an island of shadow in an ocean of night. Around 10 o'clock, Nora stiffened at her window post. "Horses," she whispered, "coming from the east." Ethan was beside her instantly, peering out into the darkness. At first he saw nothing, then gradually his eyes adjusted and he picked out movement. Riders approaching slowly, maybe 6 or 7 of them, spread out in a loose line. They were still a quarter-mile out, being cautious, probably trying to determine if the cabin was defended or if Ethan had fled with Margaret and Nora. "Margaret, get ready," Ethan said quietly. "Nora, you get away from that window and you stay down behind those flour sacks. Don't raise your head for anything unless I say so. Understand?" "Yes, sir." The child moved with impressive calm, taking her position behind the barricade they'd built. Margaret chambered a round in her rifle, the metallic click loud in the silence. Ethan took his position at the main window, the one with the clearest view of the approach, and waited. The riders came to a halt about 100 yards out, just at the edge of rifle range. One of them moved forward alone, his horse picking its way carefully in the darkness. When he was close enough for his voice to carry, he called out, "Cole! Ethan Cole! I know you're in there, and I know you've got what belongs to me. This doesn't have to get ugly. Just send out Margaret and the girl, and we'll be on our way. Nobody has to get hurt." It was Victor Hale, his voice carrying the false reasonableness of a man who was used to getting his way through intimidation rather than actual negotiation. Ethan didn't answer. "Now don't be stupid," Hale continued. "You're 1 man against 7. You might get one of us, maybe 2 if you're lucky, but then the rest will burn you out and take back what's mine anyway. All you'll accomplish is getting yourself killed for people you don't even know." Still, Ethan remained silent. He could see Hale's outline against the stars, could make out the bulk of the man's shoulders, the angle of his hat. An easy shot if he wanted to take it. But killing Victor Hale without provocation would make him a murderer in the eyes of the law, and whatever influence Hale had in the county would ensure Ethan hung for it. "All right," Hale said, his voice hardening. "You want to play it this way, we'll play it this way. But you remember, this is on you. Whatever happens next, you brought it on yourself." Hale wheeled his horse and rode back to the other riders. There was a brief consultation, voices too low to make out words, and then the line began to move again, spreading wider, coming from multiple angles. "Here they come," Ethan said quietly. "Margaret, watch the south window. Anyone tries to come through it, you put them down. Don't hesitate. Don't warn them. Just shoot." "I understand." The riders came on slowly, cautiously, clearly expecting resistance. When they were 50 yards out, Ethan fired a shot that kicked up dust 10 feet in front of the nearest horse. The animal shied violently, nearly throwing its rider. "That's your warning," Ethan shouted. "Next man who comes closer gets it in the chest." The riders pulled up short. There was another consultation, more animated this time. Then one of them, Pike, if Nora's description was accurate, pulled out a revolver and fired 3 rapid shots at the cabin. The bullets slammed into the walls, one of them punching through a window and burying itself in the far wall with a meaty thunk. Ethan tracked Pike through the scope, waiting for the man to present a clear shot. When he did, Ethan put a round through his shoulder, spinning him half out of the saddle. Pike's scream tore through the night, and the other riders scattered, looking for cover in terrain that offered none. "You son of a bitch!" Hale roared. "You just killed yourself!" "Your man's still breathing," Ethan called back. "Whether he stays that way depends on what you do next." For several long minutes, nothing happened. The riders had gone to ground somewhere in the darkness, and Ethan couldn't see them. He strained his ears, listening for the sound of boots on dry grass, the jingle of spurs, anything that would give away their positions. Then he heard it, a soft scraping sound from the south side of the cabin. Someone was trying to approach from Margaret's blind spot, using the darkness as cover. "Margaret, south window, low," Ethan said quietly. She fired without hesitation, the rifle's report deafening in the enclosed space. There was a yelp of pain, and someone cursed viciously. "Nice shot," Ethan said. "I aimed for center mass," Margaret replied, her voice shaking slightly. "I think I hit his leg." "That works too." The attack fell apart after that. With 2 men wounded and no easy approach to the cabin, Victor Hale seemed to recognize that this wasn't going to be the quick raid he'd planned. The riders retreated, collecting their wounded and pulling back beyond rifle range. "This ain't over, Cole," Hale shouted from the darkness. "I've got all the time in the world. You got food for a siege? Water? You think you can hold out forever?" Ethan didn't waste energy responding. He watched the darkness, counting riders as they regrouped. 6 visible, which meant one was still out there somewhere, probably circling to find a weak point. "Nora," he said quietly, "you see anything from your window?" "No, sir. But I hear something, like someone trying to be quiet, but not quite quiet enough." "Where?" "North side, near the lean-to where the horses are." Ethan moved to the north window, peering out into the darkness. The lean-to was barely visible, a darker shadow against the night. He watched for movement, for anything out of place, and then he saw it. A figure crouched low, moving toward the structure. They were going for the horses. Kill or scatter them, and Ethan's ability to pursue or escape evaporated. Smart tactic, which meant whoever was out there had military training, which meant it was probably Samuel. Ethan's finger tightened on the trigger, tracking the figure through the darkness. He could end this right now, put a round through his brother's spine and eliminate the threat. Samuel would never know who killed him, would die thinking Ethan was just another stranger whose life he'd made worse. The thought should have been comforting. It wasn't. "Don't do it," Nora whispered. She'd moved up beside him, somehow sensing his conflict. "He's your brother. You shoot him, you'll carry it forever." "He's trying to take away our escape," Ethan said. "Then shoot to wound, or shoot to scare. But don't kill him. Not yet. Not unless you have to." Ethan looked down at this 8-year-old child who spoke like a philosopher, and something in her eyes made him adjust his aim. Instead of shooting the figure, he put a round through the lean-to's roof, close enough to make his point. The figure froze, then slowly raised his hands and stood. In the starlight, Ethan could just make out the face. It was Samuel, older, harder, with lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when they'd last spoken, but unmistakably his brother. "That you, Ethan?" Samuel called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still night. "It's me." There was a long pause. Then Samuel laughed, but it was a bitter sound. "Should have known. Victor said the hermit in this cabin was named Cole, but I never thought—" He shook his head. 4 years. 4 years, and we end up on opposite sides of a gun. You chose your side when you started working for a man who beats women. And you chose yours when you decided to play hero." Samuel took a step forward, hands still raised. "You know how this ends, right? Victor won't stop. He can't stop. His reputation depends on getting Margaret back. on making an example of anyone who defies him. You've backed yourself into a corner you can't get out of. Then I guess I'll die in this corner. It doesn't have to be that way. Samuel's voice shifted, becoming almost pleading. Just let them go. Let Victor take Margaret and the girl. They're not worth dying for, Ethan. They're nothing to you. They asked for help. So what? People ask for help all the time. Doesn't mean you have to destroy yourself giving it to them. Ethan thought about that, about the easy road Samuel was offering. Walk away. Pretend none of this had happened. Go back to his quiet isolation and let other people's problems remain other people's problems. It was what he'd been doing for 5 years, and it had left him hollow. No, Ethan said simply. No. No. I'm done walking away from things that matter. I'm done pretending that not choosing is better than choosing wrong. If Victor Hale wants these women, he can come through me to get them. Samuel stood silent for a long moment. Then he lowered his hands slowly and said, You always were stubborn. Even when we were kids, once you decided something was right, hell itself couldn't move you. Some things don't change. Some things shouldn't. Samuel turned as if to walk away, then paused. Ethan, I'm sorry for all of it. For the war, for the things we said, for the years we wasted. I'm sorry. Before Ethan could respond, Samuel melted back into the darkness, moving with the practiced ease of someone who knew how to disappear. Within seconds, he was gone, leaving Ethan staring at empty space and wondering what the apology had meant. The rest of the night passed without further incident. Victor Hale pulled his men back to a camp about a mile away, close enough to maintain pressure, but far enough to be out of rifle range. Ethan could see their fire burning in the distance, could imagine them tending their wounded and planning their next move. Margaret and Nora slept in shifts, one always awake and watching while the other rested. Ethan didn't sleep at all. He kept watch through the dark hours, his mind turning over the problem from every angle, looking for a solution that didn't end in blood. He found none. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, painting the prairie in shades of gray and rose, Nora came to stand beside him at the window. Your brother seems sad, she said. He has reason to be. But he's still alive. You're still alive. Doesn't that mean there's hope? Ethan looked at this child who had seen too much and understood too well, and he realized she was right. As long as they were all still breathing, as long as choices remained unmade and paths untaken, there was still a chance for something other than tragedy. The question was whether any of them were brave enough to take it. The sun rose on a landscape transformed by violence and possibility. Smoke from Victor Hale's distant campfire drifted across the prairie, mixing with morning mist that clung to the low places like something reluctant to burn away. Ethan had been awake for 36 hours straight, sustained by coffee and the knife-edge awareness that came from knowing death might arrive with the next heartbeat. His eyes felt like they'd been rubbed with sand. His hands trembled slightly when he lifted his rifle, but his mind remained sharp, turning over the problem of their survival with methodical precision. Margaret was awake now too, moving carefully around the cabin despite her injuries. The night's violence had changed something in her expression. The fear was still there, but it had been joined by something harder, something that looked almost like determination. She checked the rifle Ethan had given her, her movements economical and practiced, and positioned herself at the south window without being asked. How many are still out there? She asked quietly. 5, maybe 6. 2 are wounded, but not badly enough to stop them from fighting. Pike took a shoulder shot, and whoever you hit last night is probably walking with a limp today. Good, Margaret said, and there was no apology in her voice. I hope it hurts. Nora emerged from behind the flour sack barricade where she'd finally fallen asleep near dawn. Her hair was tangled, her dress wrinkled, but her eyes were clear and alert. She went immediately to the window, scanning the horizon with the systematic attention of a trained sentry. They're moving, she said. 3 riders coming this way slow. The others are staying back at the camp. Ethan moved to her position and looked out. Sure enough, 3 horsemen were approaching at a walk, hands visible and empty. A parley, then. Victor Hale was either running low on options or trying a different tactic. Stay inside, Ethan told Margaret and Nora. Keep your weapons ready. This could be a trick. He stepped out onto the small porch, rifle held loosely but ready to snap up and fire if needed. The morning air was already warming, promising another day of brutal heat. The riders came on steadily, and as they got closer, Ethan could make out their faces. Victor Hale in the center, broad and confident despite last night's setback. On his left, a lean man with hard eyes and a blood-stained bandage on his shoulder. Pike, clearly, too mean to let a bullet slow him down much. And on Hale's right, looking older and more worn than Ethan remembered, was Samuel. They stopped 20 feet from the cabin, just beyond easy pistol range. Victor Hale's face was composed, almost pleasant, as if they were neighbors meeting to discuss fence lines rather than enemies counting their dead. "Morning, Cole," Hale said. "Hell of a night, wasn't it?" Ethan didn't respond. He watched Pike's hands, watched Samuel's face, watched for any sign of treachery. "I'll be honest with you," Hale continued. "You've surprised me. Most men would have folded by now, handed over my property, and taken whatever money I offered to keep quiet about the whole affair. But you're either braver or stupider than most men, and I haven't quite figured out which." "State your business or ride on," Ethan said. Hale's smile didn't waver. "My business is simple. I want what belongs to me. You've made that more expensive than I anticipated, and I respect that. So I'm prepared to make you an offer. $500, cash money, and you walk away from this. Take your horses, take whatever supplies you need, and head west. By the time you make it to California, this will all be forgotten. Margaret and the girl come back with me. We settle our domestic affairs in private like civilized people, and everyone lives to see another sunrise." "No," Ethan said. Hale's smile thinned. "You didn't let me finish. If you refuse, if you insist on making this harder than it needs to be, then we'll come at you again tonight, and the night after that, and every night until your ammunition runs out or your luck does. We can afford to wait. Can you?" "I can wait as long as it takes," Pike spoke up, his voice a rasp of barely contained violence. "You shot me, you son of a bitch. You think money makes that right? You think I'm going to forget that?" "Pike, shut up," Hale said without looking at him. Then to Ethan, "My associate raises a fair point. Some debts can't be settled with gold. Some things require blood. But I'm a reasonable man, Cole. I'm willing to overlook last night's unpleasantness if you're willing to be reasonable too. Otherwise, well, Pike here is very good at holding grudges." Samuel had been silent through all of this, his face carefully neutral. Now he spoke, his voice quiet but carrying clearly. "Ethan, take the money, please. You can't win this, and dying for people you barely know won't change anything." "You don't know what I know about them," Ethan replied, looking directly at his brother. "And you don't get to tell me what's worth dying for. Not anymore." Something flickered across Samuel's face, pain, maybe, or regret. "We're still brothers. That has to count for something. It would count for more if you weren't riding with the man who put those bruises on Margaret's face." "You think it's that simple?" Samuel's voice rose, anger bleeding through. "You think I had choices? You think I ended up here because I wanted to work for a man like Victor Hale? I was broke, Ethan, dying broke in a mining camp with nothing but a bum leg and memories of a war I couldn't forget. Victor offered me work, offered me purpose, and I took it because the alternative was putting a gun in my mouth. So don't you dare judge me from your comfortable little cabin and your righteous little stand." The words hung between them, raw and honest. Ethan saw his brother clearly for the first time in years, not the laughing boy who'd followed him around as children, not the angry wounded soldier who'd pushed him away, but a man broken by the same war that had broken Ethan, just in different ways. "You always had a choice, Sam," Ethan said quietly. "You just chose wrong." Victor Hale had been watching this exchange with interest, his expression calculating. Now he interjected, his voice smooth as oil. "Touching, really. But we're wasting daylight, and I've got a ranch to run. Cole, for the last time, take the money and ride out. Or die here defending people who'll forget your name before your body's cold. Your choice." Behind Ethan, the cabin door opened and Margaret stepped out, rifle in hand despite the pain it clearly caused her to move. She positioned herself beside Ethan, her face pale, but determined. "I'm not property, Victor," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "I'm not yours to take back. and my daughter isn't yours to raise. We're done. We're finished. And if you can't accept it like a man, then you never deserve to call yourself one." Hale's face darkened, the pleasant mask slipping to reveal the rage underneath. "Get back in that house, Margaret. You're embarrassing yourself." "The only one who should be embarrassed is you. All this, the guns, the threats, the violence, just because you can't accept that a woman walked away from you. Do you know how pathetic that is? How small?" Pike's hand drifted toward his gun, and Ethan's rifle came up instantly, centered on the man's chest. "Don't," Ethan said softly. For a long moment, nobody moved. The morning air felt charged with possibility, with the potential for violence that could explode in any direction. Then Victor Hale laughed, but there was nothing amused in the sound. "You've got spirit, Margaret. I'll give you that. More than I thought. But spirit doesn't stop bullets, and it doesn't change the law. You're my wife under territorial statute, which means you're my property same as my cattle or my horses, and that child is my legal dependent. Those are facts, not opinions, and facts don't care about your feelings or his heroics." "Then change the law," Margaret said, "or admit that you're hiding behind it because you know your claim is worthless without legal force. You don't love me, Victor. You never did. You just can't stand losing something you think you own." Hale's jaw clenched, a muscle jumping beneath the skin. "Last chance, both of you. Take the money and walk, or dig your graves right here. I'm done being reasonable." "We're done too," Ethan said. "Ride out while you still can." Hale wheeled his horse violently, jerking the reins hard enough to make the animal's mouth foam. Pike followed immediately, hand still hovering near his pistol, eyes promising future violence. Samuel lingered a moment longer, looking at Ethan with an expression that might have been sorrow or might have been resignation. "You're making a mistake, brother," Samuel said. "Probably," Ethan replied. "Won't be my first. Won't be my last." Samuel nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd already known. Then he turned his horse and followed the others back toward their distant camp, leaving Ethan and Margaret standing in the morning heat, alive for another day but running out of tomorrow's fast. Margaret wavered on her feet, and Ethan caught her elbow, steadying her. "You shouldn't have come out here. You need rest." "I needed to say those things," Margaret said. "I needed him to hear them from me, not filtered through you or anyone else. I needed to tell him I'm not afraid anymore." "Are you afraid?" Margaret's laugh was shaky. "Terrified. But being afraid and being controlled by fear are different things. Victor taught me that, though not the way he intended." They went back inside where Nora was waiting, her small face tight with worry. She ran to her mother, and Margaret folded her into a one-armed embrace, kissing the top of her head. "Is it over?" Nora asked. "Not yet, baby. But we're still here. We're still fighting. That counts for something." Ethan moved to the table and sat down heavily, the exhaustion finally catching up with him. His hands were shaking badly now, adrenaline aftershocks running through his system. He needed sleep desperately, but sleep meant letting his guard down, and he couldn't afford that luxury. "You should rest," Margaret said, echoing his earlier words. "I can keep watch for a few hours. Give you time to close your eyes." "I'm fine." "You're dead on your feet. You're no good to us if you collapse." She moved to stand in front of him, her expression firm despite the pain he could see in every line of her body. "Please, Ethan, let someone help you for once." The use of his first name, the gentle insistence, broke through his resistance. He nodded slowly and moved to the bed, not even bothering to remove his boots before collapsing onto the mattress. Sleep took him immediately, dragging him down into darkness that was mercifully free of dreams. He woke to voices arguing in harsh whispers. The light filtering through the windows told him it was afternoon, which meant he'd slept for 6 or 7 hours. He sat up quickly, reaching for his rifle, and found Margaret and Nora locked in what appeared to be a serious disagreement. "Absolutely not," Margaret was saying. "You're 8 years old, Nora. This isn't your fight." "It's more my fight than anyone's," Nora replied, her voice calm but unyielding. "I lived in that house. I watched what he did to you. If there's a way to end this without more people dying, I have to try." "What's going on?" Ethan asked. Both of them turned to look at him. Margaret's face was flushed with anger and fear, while Nora's showed nothing but that eerie certainty she seemed to carry like a birthright. "Nora has an insane idea," Margaret said. She wants to go to Victor's camp and talk to him. Ethan's blood went cold. Absolutely not. You see, Margaret said to Nora. Even Mr. Cole agrees. It's too dangerous. It's dangerous staying here too, Nora said. Every day we wait, the situation gets worse. Victor's pride is wounded, which makes him more dangerous. His men are getting restless, probably wondering if the pay is worth the trouble. And Samuel is conflicted. I could see it in his face this morning. If someone could talk to them, really talk to them, maybe we could find a way out that doesn't end with everyone dead. And you think that someone should be you? Ethan asked. An 8-year-old child? I think I'm the only one Victor might listen to. He sees me as his stepdaughter, as someone he has authority over. If I went to him, if I spoke to him the way he expects to be spoken to, I might be able to plant seeds of doubt, make him question whether this is worth destroying his reputation over. The logic was sound, which made it even more terrifying. Ethan had seen military officers younger than Nora who understood tactics and human nature just as well. But understanding and execution were different things, and sending a child into a camp of violent men went against every instinct he had. It's not happening, he said flatly. We'll find another way. Nora's eyes met his, and in them he saw not defiance but a terrible ancient sadness. There is no other way. You know that. Every option we have ends in blood. But maybe, just maybe, I can change the equation. Make it so Victor backs down because staying costs more than leaving. And if you're wrong, if he takes you and uses you as leverage against your mother, then you do what you have to do. But I don't think he will. I've lived with him for 3 years. I know how he thinks. He sees me as a child, which means he underestimates me. That's an advantage I can use. Margaret made a choked sound, somewhere between a laugh and a sob. I can't let you do this, Nora. I can't put you in danger to save myself. What kind of mother would that make me? Nora went to her mother and took her hand, speaking with a gentleness that seemed beyond her years. The kind who taught me that standing up for what's right matters more than being safe. The kind who walked 20 miles with broken ribs to get us away from him. The kind who picked up a rifle last night and shot a man to protect us. You've already shown me what kind of mother you are, Mama. You're the kind worth fighting for. The words broke something in Margaret. She pulled Nora close, tears streaming down her face, and held her like she'd never let go. Ethan watched them, his throat tight, and knew that whatever he said, whatever arguments he made, this child had already decided her course. If we're going to do this, he said quietly, we do it smart. No improvising, no taking risks we haven't planned for. And at the first sign of trouble, we pull you out. Agreed? Nora looked up from her mother's embrace. Agreed. They spent the next hour planning. Ethan would accompany Nora most of the way, staying close enough to intervene if things went wrong, but far enough back that Victor wouldn't see him as a direct threat. Nora would approach the camp openly, hands visible, and request an audience with Victor. She'd speak her piece, plant whatever seeds of doubt she could, and then return. If Victor tried to detain her, if anyone laid hands on her or threatened her, Ethan would open fire from cover and damn the consequences. It was a terrible plan built on hope and desperation, but it was better than sitting in the cabin waiting for the inevitable assault. Margaret hated every second of it, but she could see the logic too. Sometimes the only way forward was through the fire. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Ethan and Nora set out. They moved on foot, using the terrain for cover, working their way toward the distant campfire that marked Victor's position. Ethan carried his rifle and enough ammunition to fight a small war. Nora carried nothing but her courage and the kind of faith that only children seemed to possess. Faith that words could change hearts, that truth could overcome lies, that somewhere underneath the violence and cruelty, men could still choose to be better than their worst impulses. When they were 100 yards from the camp, Ethan stopped and knelt beside Nora. You remember what we talked about? You say what you need to say and you get out. Don't let him draw you into arguments. Don't let him make you angry. You're there to plant seeds, not harvest crops. Understand? I understand. And if things go bad, you'll be watching. I know. Nora smiled, and for a moment she looked like the child she should have been, free and unburdened and trusting. Thank you, Mr. Cole, for everything. Before Ethan could respond, she turned and walked toward the camp, her small figure silhouetted against the dying light. Ethan moved into position behind a low rise, the rifle ready, his heart hammering against his ribs like it was trying to escape his chest. He watched Nora approach the camp, watched the men around the fire turn to stare at her, watched Victor Hale stand up with an expression of shock that quickly morphed into something darker. He was too far away to hear the conversation, but he could track it in the body language, Nora standing straight and calm, Victor looming over her, the other men forming a loose circle around them like spectators at a prize fight. The conversation went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes. Ethan's finger never left the trigger guard, his breathing controlled and steady, watching for any sign that he needed to start shooting. Once, Pike moved toward Nora with his hand raised, and Ethan's finger tightened on the trigger until Samuel stepped between them, saying something sharp that made Pike back off. Then Nora was walking away, moving with the same steady calm she'd shown walking in. The men didn't follow, didn't try to stop her. They just watched her go, and on Victor Hale's face was an expression Ethan couldn't quite read. Not quite anger, not quite fear, but something in between that suggested Nora had found her mark. When she reached Ethan's position, she was trembling violently, the adrenaline and fear she'd been holding back finally breaking through. He pulled her into his arms and held her while she shook, whispering reassurances that might or might not have been true. "Did it work?" he asked when she'd calmed enough to speak. "I don't know," Nora said, her voice muffled against his chest. "But I told him things he needed to hear, about how people in town are watching this, about how his reputation will suffer if he's seen as the man who can't control one woman without bringing an army, about how the other ranchers will see him as weak if he needs 6 men to bring back a wife who doesn't want him. I told him that letting us go would show strength, that it would prove he's above petty revenge, and I told him that Samuel is unhappy working for him, that he's losing the loyalty of his best men." How did he react? He was angry, but he was also thinking. I could see it in his eyes. Victor isn't stupid, Mr. Cole. He's cruel and violent and terrible, but he's not stupid. He understands that this situation is costing him more than he expected. Whether that's enough to make him back down, I don't know. But at least now he's questioning whether it's worth it. They made their way back to the cabin as darkness fell, moving carefully through terrain that could hide a dozen ambushes. When they finally stepped through the door, Margaret was waiting, her face pale and drawn, and she swept Nora into an embrace that spoke of all the terror and relief words couldn't hold. "Don't ever do that again," Margaret whispered fiercely. "Don't ever scare me like that again." "I had to, Mama. You know I did." "I know. That doesn't mean I have to like it." They ate a cold meal in tense silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Ethan kept watch at the window, scanning the darkness for movement, for any sign that Victor had decided to press his advantage while they were tired and worn down. But the night remained quiet, and the distant campfire burned steady and unchanged. Around midnight, Nora spoke from her position on the floor, her voice thoughtful. "Mr. Cole, can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Why did you really help us? You could have turned us away that first night. You could have given us supplies and sent us on our way, but you let us stay and now you're risking everything for people you didn't know existed a few days ago. Why?" Ethan was quiet for a long time, searching for an answer that was both true and something a child could understand. Finally, he said, "During the war, I saw a lot of people die. Some of them died because I couldn't save them, because my skills weren't enough or the damage was too severe. But some of them died because other people chose not to help, chose to look away, chose to decide that someone else's life wasn't worth the trouble. I told myself I'd never be that person, that if I had the means to help and chose not to, I'd be just as guilty as the people who did the killing." "That's a heavy burden to carry," Nora said softly. "It's lighter than the alternative." Margaret spoke from the bed where she was resting, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think I've properly thanked you, Ethan, for any of this. For opening your door, for defending us, for being willing to die so that Nora and I might live. There aren't words big enough for that kind of gratitude." "Then don't use words," Ethan said. "Just survive. Make it through this, build a good life somewhere safe, and raise that remarkable daughter of yours to be the kind of woman who stands up for what's right, even when it's hard. That'll be thanks enough." They fell silent again. But it was a different kind of silence now. Not the tense waiting for violence, but something almost companionable, the shared quiet of people who'd been through fire together and come out changed on the other side. The night wore on. Ethan kept watch, his thoughts drifting between past and present, between the brother he'd lost and the brother who'd somehow found him again, between the life he'd built on isolation and the possibility that maybe, just maybe, there was another way to live. Just before dawn, when the darkness was deepest and the world seemed to hold its breath before the coming light, Ethan saw movement from the camp. A single rider coming toward the cabin at a walk. He brought the rifle up, tracking the figure through the darkness, his finger on the trigger. As the rider came closer, Ethan recognized the way he sat in the saddle, the angle of his shoulders. It was Samuel, riding alone, unarmed, as far as Ethan could tell. "Margaret, wake up," Ethan said quietly. "We've got company." Margaret was instantly alert, moving to her position with the rifle despite the pain it clearly caused. Nora woke more slowly, rubbing her eyes, but she was ready too, watching the approaching rider with those ancient, knowing eyes. Samuel stopped 50 feet from the cabin and called out, his voice carrying clearly in the pre-dawn stillness. "Ethan, I need to talk to you. Just talk, I swear. I'm not armed." Ethan stepped out onto the porch, rifle ready. "Say what you came to say." Samuel dismounted slowly, hands visible, and walked forward until he was close enough that they could speak without shouting. In the faint light, Ethan could see his brother's face clearly for the first time, the lines of exhaustion and regret, the eyes that had seen too much and forgotten nothing. "I'm done," Samuel said simply. "I'm done with Victor, done with this life, done with being the kind of man who stands by while bad things happen to good people. That little girl who came to camp tonight, she looked me in the eye and asked me when I'd decided to become the kind of person our parents would be ashamed of. And I didn't have an answer for her. Because the truth is, I've known for a while that this was wrong. I just didn't have the courage to admit it." "What are you saying, Sam?" "I'm saying I want to help. I want to tell you everything I know about Victor's plans, his resources, his weaknesses. I want to make this right. Not because I think it'll fix everything I've done wrong, but because it's the only decent thing left to do." Ethan studied his brother's face, looking for deception or hidden motives. He found only exhaustion and a desperate kind of hope, the look of a man who'd been drowning and suddenly glimpsed the possibility of shore. "Why should I trust you?" "You shouldn't," Samuel said. "I haven't given you any reason to, but I'm asking you to anyway. I'm asking you to let me prove that I'm still your brother, that somewhere underneath all the mistakes and bad choices, I'm still someone worth saving." The words hung in the air between them, and Ethan felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Trust Samuel and risk betrayal, or turn him away and lose the one advantage they might have in the coming fight. Before he could answer, Nora's voice came from the doorway. "Let him help, Mr. Cole. He's telling the truth. I can feel it." Ethan looked at the child, at her certainty and faith, and then back at his brother. Samuel was watching him with an expression that was equal parts hope and resignation, ready to accept whatever judgment Ethan handed down. "All right," Ethan said finally. "Come inside. Tell us what you know." "But Sam, if you're lying, if this is some trick of Victor's, I won't hesitate, brother or not." "I know," Samuel said. "I wouldn't expect anything less." He followed Ethan into the cabin, and as the first light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, the four of them sat down together to plan the end of Victor Hale's reign of terror, a doctor who'd tried to forget, a woman who'd learned to fight back, a child who saw too much, and a soldier who'd finally found something worth being loyal to. The pieces were all in place. Now they just had to see if courage and desperation could overcome violence and power, if mercy could prove stronger than revenge, and if a family built from broken pieces could somehow hold together long enough to see another sunrise. Samuel sat at the table with his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee Margaret had poured for him, steam rising between his weathered fingers like prayers ascending. The resemblance between the brothers was unmistakable now that they were side by side. The same strong jaw, the same deep-set eyes, though Samuel's carried a weariness that made him look 10 years older than he was. He'd removed his gun belt at the door, laying it carefully on the floor as a gesture of good faith that convinced no one but seemed necessary anyway. "Victor's planning to hit you tomorrow night," Samuel said without preamble. "He's done playing games. He sent a rider to his ranch this morning to bring back another 8 men, experienced hands who know how to handle trouble. By this time tomorrow, he'll have 15 guns pointed at this cabin, and no amount of shooting straight is going to save you from those odds. Ethan absorbed this information with the calm of a man who'd already accepted that death was a likely outcome. Why wait until tomorrow? Why not come today? Because he's smart enough to know that rushing gets people killed. He wants overwhelming force, wants to make sure when he comes, there's no question about how it ends. And because he's angry now. That little speech Nora gave him last night, it got under his skin deeper than any bullet could. He's not just trying to get Margaret back anymore. He's trying to prove a point. What point? Margaret asked, her voice tight. Samuel looked at her with something like sympathy. That nobody defies him and lives to talk about it. That his word is law in this county, and anyone who thinks different ends up dead or broken. You walking away from him challenged that, and the longer this drags on, the weaker he looks. So now it's not about you anymore. It's about his reputation. Men and their damned pride, Margaret said bitterly. How many people have to die because one man can't admit he was wrong? In my experience, too many. Samuel took a long drink of his coffee, his hands shaking slightly. I've been riding with Victor for 6 months, and I've seen what happens to people who cross him. There was a rancher north of here who refused to sell his water rights. Victor had his barn burned down in the middle of the night. A shopkeeper in town who complained about late payments ended up beaten so badly he couldn't work for 2 months. And a woman who worked in the saloon, who made the mistake of rejecting Victor's advances publicly, she disappeared. Nobody ever found her body, but everybody knows what happened. The words fell into the small cabin like stones into still water, spreading ripples of horror and understanding. Nora had gone very pale, her small hands clasped together so tightly the knuckles showed white. Why didn't anyone stop him? She asked quietly. Why didn't the law do something? Because the law is his cousin, remember? Sheriff Dalton knows his job to Victor's family connections and his continued employment to not asking questions Victor doesn't want answered. The judge takes bribes, the mayor's in Victor's pocket, and anyone with the courage to stand up to him either gets bought off or run out of the county. It's a whole system built to keep men like Victor in power and everyone else afraid. Ethan had heard similar stories from a dozen different territories, had seen how power corrupted in places where law was more suggestion than certainty. Then we can't count on legal protection even if we survive this. Margaret walks into town claiming abuse, and the sheriff will hand her right back to Victor. Worse than that, Samuel said. He'll charge you with kidnapping and probably find a judge willing to call it a hanging offense. In Victor's version of events, you're a deranged hermit who stole his wife and stepdaughter at gunpoint. Margaret and Nora will be too scared to contradict him, and any evidence of abuse will be explained away as injuries you inflicted. Margaret made a sound like she'd been punched. So even if we survive, we lose? Not necessarily. Samuel leaned forward, his voice dropping to something almost conspiratorial. Victor's power isn't absolute. It depends on fear and the perception of invincibility. If that perception breaks, if people see him failing, losing control, being humiliated, then suddenly the ones who've been too afraid to speak up might find their courage. The ranchers he's been squeezing, the businessmen he's been threatening, the families he's been terrorizing, they're all waiting for someone to prove Victor can bleed. You're talking about more than just surviving this, Ethan said slowly, understanding dawning. You're talking about destroying him completely. I'm talking about making sure that when this is over, Victor Hale doesn't have the power to hurt anyone ever again. And I think I know how to do it. Over the next hour, Samuel laid out everything he knew about Victor's operation. The books he kept that documented bribes and illegal dealings, the witnesses who'd been paid off or threatened into silence. The evidence of crimes that went back years, all carefully cataloged in a safe at Victor's ranch because he was arrogant enough to believe nobody would ever dare use it against him. He keeps records? Margaret asked, incredulous. Of his own crimes. Insurance, Samuel explained. If anyone ever tries to move against him, he can threaten to expose their complicity. The sheriff, the judge, half the prominent men in the county, they're all in those books. It's mutual assured destruction, which keeps everyone in line. But if someone who wasn't implicated got hold of those records, Ethan said thoughtfully, someone who had nothing to lose by exposing everything, then the whole house of cards comes down, Samuel finished. Victor's allies would turn on him faster than rats leaving a sinking ship. And without their protection, he's just another rancher with a mean streak and a lot of enemies. Nora had been quiet through most of this, but now she spoke up, her voice cutting through the planning like a knife. The safe is in his study. Second floor of the main house, north side. It's built into the wall behind a painting of horses. I've seen him open it. He always checks it before he leaves the ranch, like he's making sure his secrets are still safe. All three adults turned to stare at her. Samuel recovered first, a slow smile spreading across his face. You really do see everything, don't you? I had to, Nora said simply. Not seeing things in that house could get you hurt. Ethan stood and paced to the window, his mind working through the implications. So we need to get to Victor's ranch, break into his study, crack his safe, and steal records that could bring down half the powerful men in the county. All while he's here with 15 men trying to kill us. That's quite a plan. It's insane, Margaret said flatly. It'll never work. It's our only option, Samuel countered. Everything else is just buying time until Victor's numbers overwhelm you. But if we can get those records, if we can expose what he's really been doing, then suddenly we're not fugitives anymore. We're witnesses to corruption, and killing us becomes too risky even for Victor. How do you propose we get to the ranch? Ethan asked. Even if we could slip past Victor's camp, the ranch will have men guarding it. 3 men, Samuel said. Maybe 4. Everyone else is either here or being brought here for the assault tomorrow. The ranch is as vulnerable as it's ever going to be. If we move tonight while Victor thinks we're pinned down and helpless, we could be in and out before anyone knows what happened. The plan was forming shape in Ethan's mind, pieces falling into place with the inexorable logic of desperation. It was dangerous and probably doomed, but it was better than sitting in this cabin waiting to be overrun by superior numbers. We'd need a distraction, he said slowly. Something to keep Victor's attention focused here while we're at the ranch. I can provide that, Margaret said suddenly. All eyes turned to her and she straightened despite the pain in her ribs, her face set with determination. I'll stay here. Make it look like you're still defending the cabin. Keep fires burning, maybe take some shots at anyone who gets too close. By the time Victor realizes it's a trick, you'll be long gone. Absolutely not, Ethan said. You can barely stand, and if Victor decides to rush the cabin, then I'll do what I have to do. Margaret's voice was steel wrapped in velvet. You think I can't defend one small building for a few hours? You think I haven't learned anything from watching you prepare this place? I've got rifles, ammunition, and enough stubbornness to make Victor regret every step he takes toward that door. Mama, no, Nora said, fear cracking through her usual composure. You can't stay here alone. What if something goes wrong? Margaret knelt with difficulty and took her daughter's face in her hands. Baby, I need you to listen to me. Everything I've done for the past 3 years has been about keeping you safe. Every beating I took, every humiliation I endured, it was all to protect you from Victor's attention. But I can't protect you anymore by just surviving. I need to fight. And sometimes fighting means taking risks. This is more than a risk, Ethan said. This is suicide. No, Margaret replied, standing to face him. Suicide is giving up. This is choosing to be part of the solution instead of just another problem that needs solving. You're going to need every gun you can get at that ranch. And I'll be more useful here keeping Victor worried than I would be slowing you down with broken ribs and a busted arm. Samuel cleared his throat. She's right, Ethan. Much as I hate to admit it, if we all disappear, Victor will know something's wrong immediately. But if someone stays behind, keeps up the appearance of defending the cabin, it buys us the time we need. Ethan wanted to argue, wanted to find a solution that didn't involve leaving an injured woman alone to face a violent man and his small army. But military training had taught him to recognize when personal feelings had to give way to tactical necessity, and this was one of those times. Margaret was right. They needed the distraction, and she was the logical choice to provide it. All right, he said, the word tasting like defeat. But we leave you enough ammunition to hold off the entire territorial army, and at the first sign that you're being overrun, you slip out the back and run. Don't try to be a hero, just survive long enough for us to get back. Same to you, Margaret said, and there was something in her eyes that made Ethan's chest tighten. It was the look of a woman who'd made peace with the possibility of dying, but was determined to die on her own terms. They spent the rest of the morning preparing. Samuel sketched out a detailed map of Victor's ranch, marking the location of the main house, the bunkhouse where the remaining hands would be sleeping, and the most likely patrol routes. Ethan gathered what supplies they'd need: rope, tools for breaking into the safe, dark clothing to blend into the night. Nora, despite her mother's protests, insisted she was coming too, and the determination in her voice left no room for argument. "I know that house better than anyone," she said. "I know which floorboards creak, which doors stick, where the shadows fall. You need me." It was hard to argue with that logic, even though every instinct Ethan had screamed against bringing a child into what was essentially a burglary that could turn deadly in a heartbeat. But Nora had proven herself more capable than most adults he'd known, and her knowledge of the ranch's layout could mean the difference between success and discovery. As afternoon wore into evening, the tension in the cabin became almost unbearable. They were committed now, past the point where second thoughts could change anything. Margaret moved through her final preparations with calm efficiency, checking weapons and ammunition, positioning supplies within easy reach, familiarizing herself with every angle and approach to the cabin. She moved like a soldier preparing for battle, and Ethan recognized the transformation. This was no longer a beaten woman hiding from her abuser. This was someone who'd found her strength in the crucible of necessity. Samuel kept glancing toward the distant campfire where Victor and his men waited, his expression troubled. "He's going to be furious when he figures out what we've done. Even if we get the records, even if we expose everything, he'll come after us. Men like Victor don't just accept defeat." "Then we'll deal with that when it happens," Ethan said, "one catastrophe at a time." As darkness fell, they made their final preparations. Ethan and Samuel would take the horses, circling wide around Victor's camp to approach the ranch from the west. Nora would ride with Ethan, her small size making her almost invisible behind him in the saddle. They'd move fast and quiet, using the night as cover, and with luck they'd be at the ranch within 2 hours. Margaret walked them to the door, her rifle held in her good arm, her face composed but pale. She hugged Nora fiercely, whispering something in her daughter's ear that made the child nod solemnly. Then she turned to Ethan. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything. For being the kind of man who opens his door when someone knocks, for being willing to stand between me and the darkness, for showing my daughter that there are still good people in this world worth believing in." "We're not done yet," Ethan said. "Don't start writing eulogies." "I'm not." Margaret's smile was sad but genuine. "I'm writing thank you notes. There's a difference." She reached up and kissed him on the cheek, a brief touch that carried the weight of all the things they hadn't said and probably never would. Then she stepped back, squared her shoulders, and became the fortress she needed to be. Ethan swung into the saddle with Nora settling in behind him, her small arms wrapped around his waist. Samuel mounted his own horse, checking his weapons one final time. They looked at each other across the small space between their horses, brothers separated by years and choices, but united now by necessity. "Like old times," Samuel said. "We never did anything like this in the old times," Ethan replied. "True, but we always had each other's backs, even when we were too stupid or stubborn to admit it. Try not to get shot, Sam." "You too, brother." They rode out into the darkness, leaving Margaret standing in the doorway of the cabin with lamplight behind her, a lone sentinel against the coming storm. Ethan looked back once and saw her raise her hand in farewell or benediction or simple acknowledgement of the insanity they were all committed to now. The ride to Victor's ranch took 3 hours, not 2. They had to circle wide to avoid sentries, had to walk the horses through sections where hoofbeats might carry, had to stop twice when distant voices suggested patrols passing nearby. Nora stayed silent behind Ethan, her breathing steady and calm, showing no fear even when they had to freeze in place while 2 of Victor's men passed within 20 yards of their position. When they finally caught sight of the ranch, Ethan's heart sank. Samuel had said 3 or 4 guards, but Ethan counted 6 distinct points of lamplight moving through the compound, each one representing an armed man who could raise the alarm and end everything before it started. "More than you expected," Ethan murmured to Samuel. "Victor must have left extra men behind. Damn it." Samuel studied the layout, his face tight with concentration. "We're going to need a new approach. The front is too exposed and the back has at least 2 men patrolling." "There's a cellar entrance," Nora whispered. On the east side, hidden by overgrown brush. Mama and I used to hide there sometimes when Victor was in one of his moods. It leads up into the kitchen through a trap door that's never locked, because nobody knows it exists except us. Samuel looked at the child with something approaching awe. You're sure? I'm sure. I spent hours down there. I know every inch. They left the horses tied in a stand of cottonwoods half a mile from the ranch and approached on foot, moving with the careful silence of men who'd learned in war that noise meant death. Nora led them through the darkness like she had cat's eyes, navigating around obstacles Ethan couldn't see, stopping them twice when her instinct said guards were near, even though Ethan heard nothing. The cellar entrance was exactly where she'd said it would be, buried under years of wild growth that suggested nobody had used it in living memory. They pulled away enough brush to create an opening, and Samuel eased the door open with agonizing slowness, wincing at every creak and groan of old hinges. The cellar was pitch black and smelled of earth and mold and old potatoes. Nora took Ethan's hand and led him forward with absolute confidence, her small fingers surprisingly strong. Behind them, Samuel pulled the door closed, cutting off the last sliver of starlight and plunging them into total darkness. They moved by feel and memory, Nora guiding them around stored supplies and abandoned furniture, until finally Ethan's reaching hand found wooden stairs leading upward. At the top was the trapdoor Nora had described, and when Ethan pushed it gently, it opened without resistance into the ranch's kitchen. The house was quiet, but not empty. Somewhere above them, Ethan could hear footsteps, the low murmur of voices, the ordinary sounds of men preparing for sleep or standing watch. They'd entered through the servants' quarters, and the kitchen was dark, the fire banked to coals that provided just enough light to navigate by. Nora pointed toward a narrow staircase at the back of the kitchen, the one servants would use to move between floors without disturbing the main household. Samuel nodded and led the way up, his hand on his pistol, every muscle coiled for violence if discovery came. The second-floor hallway was lit by a single lamp burning low, creating pools of shadow they could slip between. Victor's study was the third door on the right, and as they approached it, Ethan's heart was hammering so hard he was certain everyone in the house could hear it. The door was locked, but Samuel produced a set of picks from his pocket and worked with the practiced ease of a man who'd learned this skill somewhere he probably shouldn't talk about. The lock clicked open after 30 seconds that felt like 30 years, and they slipped inside, closing the door behind them. The study was exactly as Nora had described it. Heavy furniture, dark wood paneling, and on the north wall a painting of wild horses running across an open plain. Samuel crossed to it and swung it aside on hidden hinges, revealing the safe set into the wall behind. "Can you open it?" Ethan whispered. "I can try." Victor's not particularly creative with his combinations. Probably his birthday or his wedding anniversary or something equally predictable. While Samuel worked on the safe, Ethan and Nora kept watch at the door, listening for any sound of alarm, any indication they'd been discovered. The house creaked and settled around them, old wood responding to temperature changes, and every sound made Ethan's hand tighten on his pistol. Minutes crawled by. Samuel tried combination after combination, his face sheened with sweat in the lamplight, his fingers working the dial with delicate precision. Ethan was beginning to think they'd have to give up, that Victor's paranoia had extended to creating an unbreakable combination when he heard the soft click of the safe's mechanism releasing. "Got it," Samuel breathed. "Wedding anniversary, backwards. I should have tried that first." He swung the safe open, and inside was exactly what they'd hoped for. Leather-bound ledgers, thick folders of correspondence, documents that even at a glance showed evidence of bribes, threats, and crimes that went back years. Samuel began pulling them out, stuffing them into the bag he'd brought, working with frantic efficiency. That's when they heard footsteps in the hallway outside, getting closer. Ethan's hand went to his gun, and Nora pressed herself against the wall, making herself as small as possible. The footsteps stopped right outside the door, and they heard the unmistakable sound of a key turning in a lock. Someone had discovered the door was already unlocked from the inside. The door swung open, and a man Ethan didn't recognize stood silhouetted in the lamplight from the hall, his eyes widening in shock as he registered the three intruders ransacking Victor Hale's private study. For a frozen moment, nobody moved. Then the man's hand dropped toward his gun, his mouth opening to shout an alarm, and Ethan did the only thing he could. He lunged forward, closing the distance before the man could draw, slamming into him and driving them both out into the hallway. They crashed against the opposite wall hard enough to rattle paintings in their frames. The man was strong, and he fought with the desperation of someone who knew capture meant torture or death, throwing elbows and knees while trying to reach his weapon. Ethan blocked most of the blows, using his weight to pin the man against the wall, one hand clamped over his mouth to prevent him from crying out. Behind them, Samuel appeared with a length of rope, and together they wrestled the struggling guard down, binding and gagging him with efficiency born of military experience. They dragged him into the study and shut the door, both of them breathing hard, adrenaline singing through their veins. "We need to move," Samuel said urgently. "Someone might have heard that." He grabbed the remaining documents from the safe while Ethan hoisted the bag, already heavy with stolen evidence. Nora had the door open, checking the hallway, her small face set with determination that should have been comical on a child but was instead somehow heroic. They made it down the servants' stairs, through the kitchen, and back into the cellar before the alarm was raised. But as they were pushing through the overgrown entrance, they heard shouts from inside the house, heard boots pounding on floorboards, heard someone yelling about intruders and thieves. "Run," Ethan said, and they ran. They crashed through brush and darkness, branches whipping at their faces, roots threatening to trip them with every step. Behind them, the ranch was coming alive like a kicked anthill, men pouring out of buildings, lamps being lit, horses being saddled. But Ethan and his companions had darkness on their side, and knowledge of where they were going, and the desperate strength that came from knowing capture meant death. They reached the horses and mounted in seconds that felt like hours, Nora scrambling up behind Ethan with practiced ease. Samuel grabbed the bag of documents and tied it to his saddle, and then they were riding hard through the night, bent low over their horses' necks, pushing the animals to their limit. Pursuit came quickly, 6 riders, maybe more, their shouts carrying across the prairie like hunting calls. Ethan urged his horse faster, feeling Nora's grip tighten around his waist, hearing her whispered prayers or encouragement into the wind. They had perhaps a mile lead, maybe less. The horses were tiring, foam flecking their necks, their breathing labored. Behind them, the pursuit was gaining ground, fresher mounts eating up the distance. Ethan did the math and knew they wouldn't make it back to the cabin before being overtaken. "Samuel!" he shouted over the thunder of hooves. "We need to split up. You take the documents and head for town. Get them to someone who can use them, a newspaper, a territorial marshal, anyone who's not in Victor's pocket. What about you? I'll lead them away. Buy you time. Just go." Samuel hesitated, warring impulses clear on his face. Then he nodded sharply, understanding that arguing would waste the seconds they didn't have. He veered left, his horse plunging into rougher terrain that would slow pursuit but might allow him to lose his trail in the darkness. Ethan went right, making himself obvious, making noise, drawing the hunters away from his brother and toward himself and Nora. Most of the riders followed him, only 2 breaking off to chase Samuel, and Ethan felt a grim satisfaction that the gambit had worked. But now he had 4 armed men chasing him through the darkness, and his horse was nearly finished, and dawn was still hours away. He needed a defensible position, somewhere he could make a stand, somewhere that gave him a chance of surviving long enough for Samuel to get those documents to safety. And then, rising out of the prairie like a promise, he saw the rock formation he'd noticed months ago while mapping the area around his cabin. A jumble of boulders and broken stone that created natural fortifications. The kind of place a man with a good rifle could hold off significant numbers if he was willing to die defending it. Ethan made for the rocks, his horse stumbling now, nearly spent. Behind him, the pursuit was close enough that he could hear individual voices, could hear them calling to each other, coordinating their approach. He reached the rocks and slid from the saddle, pulling Nora down with him and slapping the horse's flank to send it running, hoping it would draw at least some of their attackers away. Then he took up position in the best defensive spot he could find. Nora pressed tight against his side and waited for the men who wanted him dead to make their final approach as the night held its breath and somewhere in the distance, Margaret defended an empty cabin against enemies who had no idea they'd already lost. The rocks offered better protection than Ethan had hoped for. Deep crevices between boulders that provided cover from multiple angles, high points that gave him clear lines of sight on anyone approaching. He positioned Nora in the deepest recess, A natural cave formed where three massive stones leaned against each other and pressed his spare revolver into her hands. "You know how to use this?" "Mama taught me," Nora whispered, her voice steady, despite the fear he could see in her eyes. "Point, pull the hammer back, squeeze the trigger. Don't jerk it. Don't use it unless you have to. And if things go bad, if they get past me, you run. You understand? You don't try to be brave. You just run as fast and as far as you can. I'm not leaving you." "Nora, I'm not leaving you," she repeated, and there was steel in her voice that reminded him so much of Margaret it made his chest ache. "We're in this together, all of us. That's what family means." Ethan wanted to argue, wanted to order her to flee, but the riders were close now, their voices carrying clearly in the night air. He took up his position behind a boulder that gave him a commanding view of the approach, checked his rifle, and waited. The four men came cautiously, having learned from the previous night's engagement that Ethan Cole was not a man to be rushed carelessly. They spread out, using what cover the prairie offered, working their way toward the rocks with the coordination of experienced fighters. Ethan recognized Pike among them, his shoulder bandaged but his face set with the kind of rage that made pain irrelevant. The other three were ranch hands he'd seen at Victor's camp, hard men who'd probably done worse things than hunting fugitives through the darkness. "Cole!" Pike's voice cut through the night, ragged with fury. "You're trapped! Nowhere left to run! Come out now, and maybe we'll make it quick!" Ethan didn't waste breath responding. He sighted carefully and put a round through the hat of the man farthest to the left, close enough to make his point without killing anyone. Not yet. The man yelped and dove for cover, and the others froze, reassessing their approach. "That's how it's going to be," Pike shouted. "Fine. We've got all night and all the ammunition we need. You're just delaying the inevitable." "Maybe," Ethan called back, his voice carrying across the broken ground. "Or maybe I'm buying time for Samuel to get those documents somewhere safe. Either way, you're not taking me without paying a price you probably don't want to pay." There was a long silence. Then Pike laughed, but it was an ugly sound. "You think those papers matter? You think anyone's going to believe a word in them? Victor owns this county, owns the law, owns everything that matters. By tomorrow, Samuel will be hunted down and those documents will be burned, and you'll be dead in these rocks with that brat you're trying to protect." "We'll see," Ethan said, and fired again, this time clipping the rock inches from Pike's head, showering him with stone chips. The return fire was immediate and furious, rounds slamming into the boulders around Ethan's position, ricocheting with high-pitched whines that set his teeth on edge. He pulled back into cover, waiting for the barrage to end, listening to the shooters burn through ammunition with the kind of waste that suggested they had plenty to spare. When the firing finally stopped, Ethan risked a glance over his boulder and saw that two of the men had used the covering fire to advance, getting significantly closer to his position. They were good, these men, disciplined and experienced. This wasn't going to be easy. The fight settled into a grim pattern. The attackers would advance under covering fire, Ethan would drive them back with carefully aimed shots, and slowly, inexorably, they gained ground. Ethan's ammunition was limited, each round precious, while his opponents could afford to be wasteful. It was simple mathematics, and the equation favored the men with more bullets. An hour passed, marked by sporadic gunfire and the slow movement of stars across the sky. Ethan's arms ached from holding the rifle. His eyes burned from staring into darkness, looking for movement, and his mouth was dry with thirst and fear. Behind him, Nora remained silent, the revolver clutched in her small hands, her face pale but composed. Then everything changed. Ethan heard them before he saw them, the thunder of multiple horses approaching fast from the east. His heart sank, thinking Victor had sent reinforcements, that the fight was about to become impossible instead of just desperately difficult. But when the riders came into view in the pre-dawn light that was just beginning to paint the horizon, he saw Samuel at their head, and behind him rode a dozen men in what looked like official uniforms. Pike and his companions heard them too, and Ethan watched confusion and then fear spread across their faces as they realized they were about to be caught between Ethan's position and a force of unknown size and intent. "Federal Marshal!" a voice boomed across the prairie. "Throw down your weapons and stand where you are. You're all under arrest." For a moment, Ethan thought Pike might fight anyway, might choose death over capture. But one of the other men threw down his rifle immediately, raising his hands high, and the rest followed suit with the resignation of people who knew when they'd been beaten. Samuel rode up to Ethan's position, his face haggard but triumphant. Behind him, a tall man with a marshal's badge pinned to his vest surveyed the scene with the calm authority of someone used to bringing order to chaos. "Ethan, this is Marshal Thomas Pritchard," Samuel said, dismounting. "I found him camped outside of town, brought in from territorial headquarters to investigate complaints about corruption in the county. When I showed him Victor's ledgers, showed him the evidence of bribes and intimidation and worse, he assembled a posse and rode straight here." Pritchard walked his horse forward, his eyes taking in the scene with professional assessment. "Mr. Cole, you and your companions are safe now. These men will be taken into custody and charged with attempted murder, among other crimes. And Victor Hale is going to answer for a lot more than just domestic violence." Ethan lowered his rifle slowly, the adrenaline that had been sustaining him suddenly draining away, leaving him hollow and shaking. Nora emerged from her hiding spot and attached herself to his side, and he put his arm around her shoulders, holding her close. "Margaret," Ethan said urgently. "She's at my cabin, alone, defending it against Victor and his men. We need to get to her now." Pritchard's expression tightened. "Then let's ride. Samuel tells me she's a brave woman. Let's make sure her courage wasn't wasted." They rode hard through the growing dawn, the posse of marshals and deputized townsmen thundering across the prairie toward Ethan's cabin. As they got closer, Ethan could hear gunfire, sporadic but ongoing, and his heart clenched with fear that they were too late, that Margaret had been overrun while he was fighting his own battle in the rocks. But when they crested the final rise and the cabin came into view, what Ethan saw made him laugh with relief and pride, and something deeper he didn't have words for. The cabin still stood, smoke rising from the chimney, and around it lay clear evidence of a fierce defense. Scattered around the perimeter were discarded weapons, bloodstains in the dust, and the kind of chaos that suggested an assault that had been turned back at significant cost to the attackers. Victor Hale and his remaining men were in disarray, some wounded, others simply exhausted, gathered in a defensive cluster about 50 yards from the cabin. When they saw the marshal's posse approaching, Ethan watched Victor's face go through a rapid succession of emotions: confusion, understanding, and finally a rage so pure it was almost transcendent. "Victor Hale!" Marshal Pritchard's voice carried across the open ground with the weight of federal authority. "You and your men are under arrest for assault, attempted murder, bribery of public officials, and a list of other charges so long it'll take a week just to read them all. Surrender your weapons and submit to custody, or we will take you by force." For a terrible moment, Ethan thought Victor might choose to fight, might decide that dying in a blaze of violence was preferable to facing justice for his crimes. But his men were already throwing down their weapons, exhausted and demoralized by a night that had gone catastrophically wrong. One by one, they surrendered, until only Victor remained standing with his rifle, his face twisted with impotent fury. "This isn't over," Victor snarled. "I have friends, influence, money. You think one territorial marshal can bring me down? I'll be out within a week, and then everyone who crossed me is going to pay." "Your friends are currently being arrested," Pritchard said calmly. "Based on the evidence in those ledgers, I've sent deputies to take Sheriff Dalton and Judge Morrison into custody. Your influence died the moment your crimes became public knowledge, and your money won't help you where you're going." The words hit Victor like physical blows. He looked around at his captured men, at the marshal's posse surrounding him, at the cabin where Margaret had held out against his assault through pure determination and skill. And then slowly, the fight seemed to drain out of him. He dropped his rifle and stood there, diminished and defeated, just another criminal facing justice. Ethan dismounted and ran to the cabin, Nora close behind him. He pounded on the door, calling out, "Margaret, it's Ethan, it's over, you can open up." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then he heard the sound of furniture being moved, barricades being dismantled, and finally the door swung open to reveal Margaret standing in the doorway, her face streaked with powder smoke and exhaustion, her good arm still holding a rifle, her eyes blazing with the kind of fierce joy that came from surviving something you weren't sure you'd survive. "I held them," she said, her voice cracking. I held them off until dawn. I did it. You did it, Ethan confirmed. And then she was in his arms, the rifle clattering to the floor. And Nora was there too, and the three of them held each other while around them the machinery of justice went about its business of arresting criminals and restoring order. The next hours passed in a blur of official statements and documentation. Marshal Pritchard proved to be thorough and efficient, taking detailed accounts from everyone involved, examining the evidence Samuel had retrieved, and building a case that would ensure Victor Hale never threatened anyone again. The documents from the safe proved even more damning than Samuel had hoped, implicating not just Victor, but a network of corrupt officials who'd been enabling his crimes for years. By midday, wagons had arrived to transport the prisoners to territorial holding facilities where Victor's influence couldn't reach them. As they loaded Victor into a wagon, heavily shackled and guarded, he caught Ethan's eye one last time. "You've destroyed everything I built," Victor said, his voice hollow. "Everything I worked for. I hope you're proud." "You destroyed yourself," Ethan replied. "You just used other people's lives as the hammer. All we did was stop you from swinging it anymore." Victor had no response to that. The wagon rolled away, carrying him toward a future that involved prison cells and public trials, and the complete dismantling of the power he'd wielded for so long. As the last of the prisoners were taken away, Marshal Pritchard approached Ethan, Samuel, Margaret, and Nora, where they stood together in the shade of the cabin. "You folks did something important here," Pritchard said. "You stood up to a tyrant when everyone else was too scared. You exposed corruption that's been poisoning this county for years. The territory owes you a debt." "We just wanted to survive," Margaret said quietly. "Maybe so. But sometimes survival requires courage, and courage can change the world." Pritchard tipped his hat to them. "I'll need you all to testify at the trials, but that won't be for a few months while we build the full case. In the meantime, you're free to go wherever you like, live however you choose. The law will protect you now, I give you my word." After the marshal and his men had departed, leaving blessed silence in their wake, the four of them sat on the cabin's porch and watched the sun climb higher into a sky that seemed impossibly blue after so much darkness. "What happens now?" Nora asked, the question that was on all their minds. "Now we figure out how to live," Ethan said. "Really live, not just survive." Margaret looked at him, something unspoken passing between them. "I don't have anywhere to go. No family left, no home except the one I fled from. I don't know how to start over." "You start by deciding what kind of life you want," Samuel said, "and then you build it, one day at a time. That's what I'm going to do. I've got a lot to make up for, a lot of wrongs to right. But at least now I've got the chance to try." "You could stay here," Ethan heard himself say, looking at Margaret. "Both of you. The cabin's small, but we could expand it. Build something bigger, something that could be a real home. If you wanted, if that's something you might consider." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "Are you asking us to stay because you need help around the place, or because you've gotten used to having company?" "Maybe both," Ethan admitted. "Or maybe because somewhere over the last few days, you and Nora stopped being strangers I was helping and started being people I couldn't imagine not having in my life. I know it's fast. I know we barely know each other, but yes," Margaret said simply. "Yes, we'll stay. We'll build something here, together." Nora looked between the two adults, and then at Samuel, and her face lit up with the kind of pure joy that children could still access despite everything the world had thrown at them. "We're a family now," she said, and it wasn't a question. "I suppose we are," Ethan agreed, and realized it was true. Not a family bound by blood or law or obligation, but by choice and shared struggle and the decision to face whatever came next together, rather than alone. The summer heat continued to press down on the Montana plains, relentless and unforgiving. But in the shade of the cabin that had become a fortress and then a home, four people who'd been broken by their pasts began the work of building a future. Over the following weeks, Samuel proved true to his word about making amends. He testified at the preliminary hearings, providing detailed accounts of Victor's crimes and the network of corruption that had enabled them. His testimony, combined with the documentary evidence and accounts from dozens of other witnesses who finally felt safe enough to speak up, built a case so overwhelming that Victor's expensive lawyers could only negotiate the terms of his inevitable conviction rather than fight it. Margaret healed slowly, her ribs knitting back together, her arm regaining strength. She took to ranch work with surprising aptitude, revealing skills she'd learned from her father years ago and had suppressed during her marriage to Victor. She and Ethan worked side by side, expanding the cabin, adding rooms and improving the structure, turning it from a hermit's refuge into a genuine home. Nora blossomed in ways that broke Margaret's heart and filled it simultaneously. The ancient weariness that had made her seem so much older than her years began to fade, replaced by moments of genuine childhood, laughter over silly things, excitement about small discoveries, the ability to simply play without constantly scanning for danger. She still saw more than most children her age, still understood things with unsettling clarity, but now those gifts were balanced by the security of knowing she was safe and loved. Ethan found himself changing too, the walls he'd built around his heart over 5 years of isolation crumbling bit by bit. He started accepting visitors from town, people who'd heard about the stand against Victor Hale and wanted to meet the doctor-turned-rancher who'd helped bring down a tyrant. Some came seeking medical help, and Ethan found himself treating injuries and illnesses again, rediscovering skills he'd thought he'd abandoned forever. The night before Victor's trial was set to begin, the four of them sat on the expanded porch, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The heat had finally broken, autumn arriving with cooler temperatures and the promise of change. "Are you nervous about tomorrow?" Ethan asked Margaret. She'd be the prosecution's key witness, the living evidence of Victor's violence, and the reason the case had become public in the first place. "Terrified," Margaret admitted. "Standing up in front of all those people, telling them what he did to me, reliving all of it, but also ready. I need to do this. Need to look him in the eye and show him that he didn't break me, that I'm still here and he can't hurt me anymore." "You're the bravest person I've ever met," Ethan said quietly. "I'm not brave. I'm just done being afraid." "That's what bravery is," Samuel said from where he sat whittling a piece of wood into a toy horse for Nora. "Doing what needs doing even when you're scared to death." The trial lasted 3 days. Margaret's testimony was devastating, delivered with calm precision that made the brutality of Victor's actions even more horrifying. The doctors who'd examined her injuries testified about the severity and pattern of abuse. Samuel described the culture of violence and intimidation Victor had cultivated, and the documents from Victor's safe provided irrefutable evidence of crimes that went far beyond domestic violence into territory that shocked even hardened law enforcement officials. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Victor Hale was convicted on 17 separate counts, including assault, attempted murder, bribery, and conspiracy. The judge sentenced him to 20 years in territorial prison, and given Victor's age and health, it was effectively a life sentence. As the verdict was read, Ethan watched Victor's face crumble, watched the reality of his future sink in. The man who terrorized an entire county with violence and corruption was reduced to just another convict, and all the money and influence he'd wielded meant nothing against the weight of justice finally applied. Outside the courthouse, Margaret stood in the afternoon sun, breathing deeply like someone who'd been holding their breath for years and could finally exhale. Nora stood beside her, holding her mother's hand, and both of them looked lighter somehow, as if a physical weight had been lifted from their shoulders. "It's really over," Margaret said wonderingly. "He can't hurt us anymore. We're free." "We're free," Nora confirmed. And then she was hugging her mother, and they were both crying, and Ethan and Samuel stood back slightly, giving them space for this moment of release and relief, and the kind of joy that could only come after surviving something terrible. The months that followed brought changes none of them had anticipated. The territorial governor, embarrassed by the exposure of such widespread corruption in the county, appointed new officials and implemented reforms designed to prevent similar abuses. Marshal Pritchard was promoted and given expanded authority to investigate other counties where similar problems might exist. And the story of how a beaten woman, a child with uncanny wisdom, a reclusive doctor, and a reformed gunman had brought down a corrupt empire became something of a legend in Montana Territory. Samuel eventually left the ranch, not because things were bad, but because he needed to continue his own journey toward redemption. He took a job as a deputy marshal, using his experience to help root out the kind of corruption he'd once been part of. But he visited regularly, and the bond between the brothers, once broken, had been forged anew in the crucible of shared danger and became stronger than it had ever been before. Ethan and Margaret's relationship deepened gradually, built on mutual respect and shared experience rather than romantic fantasy. They were partners in every sense, running the ranch together, raising Nora together, building a life that neither of them had imagined possible during those desperate days when survival was the only goal. Eventually, inevitably, partnership became love, and on a spring day with wildflowers blooming across the prairie, they were married by a circuit preacher with Nora and Samuel as witnesses. Nora grew into a remarkable young woman, her early wisdom tempered by the security of a loving home, but never diminished. She became a teacher, using her gifts for seeing and understanding people to help other children who'd survived trauma find their way back to wholeness. The cabin that had sheltered them during those terrible days became a school, expanded and improved, where broken children could come to heal. On the 5th anniversary of the night Margaret had knocked on Ethan's door, the four of them, Ethan, Margaret, Nora, and Samuel, who'd ridden in for the occasion, stood on the hill overlooking the ranch that had become a home, a school, and a symbol of what was possible when people chose courage over fear. "Do you ever regret it?" Nora asked her mother. "All the pain it took to get here?" Margaret considered the question seriously, looking out over the land they'd fought for, the life they'd built, the future that had seemed impossible once but was now simply reality. "I regret that it was necessary," she said finally. "I regret that we live in a world where women and children have to fight just to be safe, where violence and corruption are allowed to flourish until someone finds the courage to stand against them. But I don't regret the choice to run, to fight, to survive. Because it brought us here, to this moment, to this life. And this life is worth every scar it took to reach it." Ethan put his arm around his wife's shoulders, watching their daughter, because that's what Nora had become to him in every way that mattered, standing tall and confident, unburdened by the weight she'd once carried. He thought about the man he'd been 5 years ago, isolated and broken, convinced that the best thing he could do was remove himself from the world so he couldn't cause or witness any more suffering. That man had been wrong. Isolation wasn't healing, it was just a slower kind of death. Real healing came from connection, from choosing to be part of something larger than your own pain, from opening your door when someone knocked, even though you knew it might bring trouble, along with the person seeking help. "Thank you," Ethan said quietly to Margaret, "for knocking, for trusting me, for being brave enough to ask for help from a stranger." "Thank you for answering," Margaret replied, "for being the kind of man who opens his door, for showing us that there are still good people in this world, that courage and kindness can overcome cruelty and violence." "We did it together," Nora said. "All of us. That's what makes it matter." Samuel raised a cup of cider and a toast. "To family. Not the one we're born into, but the one we choose. The one we fight for. The one that makes us better than we'd be alone." "To family," the others echoed, and they drank together as the sun set over the Montana plains, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber, the heat of the day finally releasing its hold as evening brought blessed coolness. The cabin stood strong against the horizon, expanded now into something that could shelter many rather than just one. The rocks where Ethan had made his stand were visible in the distance, a reminder of how close they'd come to losing everything. And beyond those rocks, somewhere out there, was the prison where Victor Hale lived out his days, his power broken, his crimes exposed, his victims free at last. It had been a hard road to this peace. It had required courage and sacrifice and the willingness to stand against overwhelming odds. It had cost them all something: innocence, illusions, the belief that the world was fair or just or kind. But it had given them something more valuable in return. It had given them each other and the knowledge that they were stronger together than any force that tried to break them apart. The heat that had carried them to this moment, the brutal summer that had driven Margaret to desperate flight, that had tested them all in ways they never imagined, was gone now, replaced by gentle autumn breezes and the promise of winter snow. But the warmth they'd found in each other, the family they'd forged in fire and darkness, that warmth would last. And on this land, in this home, They would continue building a future where children like Nora could grow up safe and loved, where women like Margaret didn't have to run from violence, where men like Ethan could find purpose in healing rather than hiding, and where brothers like Samuel could learn that redemption was always possible for those willing to do the hard work of becoming better. The night settled around them, gentle and kind, and inside the cabin that had become their fortress and then their home, lamplight glowed warm against the darkness. They had survived the heat. They had survived the violence. They had survived because they chose to stand together rather than fall alone. And that, in the end, was all that mattered.